Welcome to The Explainer. We are diving straight into something completely mind-bending today. We're looking at a scenario that brilliantly bridges the gap between historical fact and cutting-edge physics. We're unpacking The Adventure, a really fascinating story by astrophysicist Jayant Narlikar. This is a journey that is honestly going to force us to question the very fabric of reality itself. So let's get right into it. Just imagine this for a second. You wake up tomorrow, you step outside, and you suddenly realize that the fundamental history of your country, the facts you've known literally your entire life, are just completely different. Imagine that kind of utter disorientation. Well, that is exactly what happens to our protagonist. Professor Gaitonde is a seasoned historian who wakes up to find a world where his entire life's work is suddenly wrong. So let's track his physical journey here because it's a wild ride into a brand new reality. The whole thing starts with a traumatic event, a violent collision with a truck. Shortly after this, Gaitonde finds himself boarding a train called the Jijamata Express, which is running unusually fast. He crosses a border check at Sarhad Station and then steps out into Bombay. But it's a Bombay that is still heavily under British control. Walking through the city, he even spots the East India House. This is the thriving headquarters of a company that, in his timeline, was dismantled centuries ago. It's an incredibly jarring thing for him to see. Now, what is a rational, hardcore academic going to do when faced with an impossible reality? He goes right to the library, obviously. Gaitonde heads straight to the Asiatic Society Library to browse his own history books. He actually sits down and goes through the 5 volumes he wrote himself. Up to volume 4, history is exactly as he remembers it. But the final volume? Well, that is where the world basically tilts on its axis. He discovers a massive, reality-altering fork in the road in that 5th volume, and it all centers around the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761. In Reality 1, which is our familiar history, the Marathas were defeated, and that allowed British influence to expand. But in Reality 2, this crazy alternate world Gaitonde is currently in, the Marathas actually won, and they won handsomely. As a result, British influence was restricted to just tiny little pockets. It's absolutely wild to think about because it perfectly illustrates how the destiny of an entire nation can hinge on a single, minor detail. Reading through an account of the battle in this library, Gaitonde zeroes in on the exact moment history diverged. And no, it wasn't some grand strategic maneuver on the battlefield. It was simply the survival of one man, Vishwasrao, the young heir to the Peshwa. In our history, he's killed. In this new history, he lives. Searching for hard evidence, Gaitonde finds a historical account known as the Bausebanchi Bakar, and he reads this heart-stopping passage describing Vishwasrao right in the middle of the melee. The text literally says, "A shot brushed past his ear. Even the difference of a till, which translates to a sesame seed, would have led to his death." Let that sink in for a second. The trajectory of a bullet, off by the width of a sesame seed, fundamentally altered reality. Talk about a massive domino effect, right? Because Vishwasrao survives that near miss, the Maratha army gains this massive boost in morale, which leads them to a decisive victory. Consequently, their newfound power totally restricts British expansion, and all of this allows India to transition smoothly into a self-dependent democracy. An entirely new, thriving India emerges, and the whole shebang started from one missed bullet. Okay, so after this incredibly heavy historical realization, Gaitonde takes a stroll to clear his head and ends up at a public lecture at Azad Maidan. Now, keep in mind, Gaitonde is a very traditional academic. He firmly believes a lecture absolutely needs a presiding chairperson. So seeing an unoccupied presidential chair sitting up on stage, his stubborn habits kick in and he just walks right up and sits in it. But unfortunately for him, this alternate public has completely rejected that old custom. The furious crowd starts hurling tomatoes and eggs, roughing him up, and right in the middle of this chaotic, honestly kind of hilarious debacle, Gaitonde just mysteriously vanishes. And just as suddenly as he vanished, poof, Gaitonde wakes up back in his familiar reality, right there in the Azad Maidan. But there's a pretty big catch here. He has been missing for 2 whole days. With literally no memory of where his physical body actually was during that time, he naturally seeks out his brilliant scientist friend, Rajendra Deshpande, hoping to make some sense of the impossible. Now, Rajendra, being a rational scientist, initially brushes the whole tale off as just a hallucination brought on by that truck crash. But then Gaitonde reaches into his pocket. Turns out, before leaving the library in that alternate world, he had absent-mindedly shoved the Bakar into his pocket. He pulls out the actual physical torn page describing the missed bullet. Talk about a mic drop moment. Faced with hard material evidence from a world that shouldn't exist, Rajendra is completely dumbfounded and finally admits facts can be stranger than fantasies. Here's where the hard science steps in to explain the impossible. Rajendra uses two modern theories to rationalize what happened. First up is catastrophe theory. This branch of science studies how microscopic changes in circumstances can lead to sudden, massive shifts in a complex system. And a battle is the perfect example of a complex system. It all comes down to morale. In our history, Vishwasral's death triggered a catastrophic collapse in spirit. But in the alternate timeline, that bullet missing by a mere sesame seed triggered a catastrophic positive shift. But wait, how did Gaitonde actually cross over? How did he get there? Enter quantum theory. Specifically, the lack of determinism. In quantum physics, you just cannot definitively predict the exact outcome of an event. Instead, multiple possible outcomes can actually exist simultaneously. Rajendra explains that at a highly crucial juncture, like, say, a major battle, reality can branch out. It can create entirely separate, viable, alternative worlds that are just running parallel to each other. To make this a bit easier to wrap your head around, think about electrons orbiting an atom. We know an electron can suddenly jump from a high-energy state to low one. Rajendra proposes an absolutely wild idea here. He says Gaitonde experienced a similar transition, but on a macroscopic level. So instead of a tiny electron jumping between energy states, a full-grown human being literally quantum leaped from our world into a parallel historical reality, lived there for 2 days, and jumped back. So you're probably wondering, why him? And why at that exact moment? Well, in science, you need an interaction to cause a transition. For Gaitonde, the violent impact of the truck collision provided that necessary physical trigger. But the actual direction of the jump, where he went, was determined by his mind. Right before the crash, his brain neurons were firing wildly. He was actively thinking about catastrophe theory and the Battle of Panipat. That exact intense mental focus during a moment of physical trauma essentially pushed his consciousness straight into that specific alternate timeline. It's a truly brilliant collision of history and science, which leaves us with a fascinating, kind of terrifying question to end on. If a single event, a bullet missing by just a sesame seed, can create an entirely different, fully functioning reality, then how fixed is our own world, really? Are we all simply navigating just one path in a limitless web of alternate histories? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you open a history book. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the reality around you.